We have the pleasure of having here with us today Mr. Phil Evans, Director General of EUMETSAT, Ms. Silvia Castañer, Director of Administration, and Mr. Paul Cunet, Head of Strategy and International Relations. So I think it's worth noting that last EUMETSAT visit to AEMET was back in 2012. And since then, obviously, as we are in a field that evolves rapidly and of science and technology, there's been many changes. We have a new generation of geostationary satellites in orbit. We share common challenges, both organizations, machine learning, IA, and EUMETSAT is already starting to work in new programs. So, and of course, we also have new faces in both organizations.
Yeah. Well, old faces in new jobs. So.
So I think this is a great opportunity to bring our organizations closer together, foster collaboration. And well, I don't want to waste more time in presentations. I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Phil Evans, who's going to give a presentation about all the exciting activities going on at EUMETSAT nowadays. So, Phil, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm ashamed to say that despite my career in meteorology being nearly 40 years, I've never been to AEMET before. So it's a pleasure to be here. And just also again to thank AEMET for hosting our delegate body meetings in Toledo this week. It was an excellent venue, well organised, and I'm sure that helped in terms of the success of the meeting. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the organisation's recent successes, some of our plans for the future, and hopefully I won't take so long that there'll be room for some questions at the end. And as we go along, if anyone certainly in the room wants to clarify anything, ask a question, please don't hesitate. I'd rather this was useful for you. Next slide, please. So, as I said, I'm going to talk about our recent main achievements, some of the strategic issues that we're looking at, and many of those are, I think, as has already been said, very similar to the issues you face. The status of our key programs, our work with the European Commission, future opportunities, and some issues around some elements around our financial planning, which is a key issue for our members. Well, of course, you will excuse us for talking about the successful launch of MTGI at the end of last year from Kourou in French Guiana. This is the first of our next generation satellites. So it's a geostationary satellite flying two principal instruments. So flying two instruments, the flexible combined imager and the lightning imager, and I'll come back to those in a second. It was hugely challenging, both in the run-up to launch, the amount of work necessary for teams in EUMETSAT, ESA, and industrial partners across Europe was enormous. In part because there were additional problems because of the invasion of Ukraine, and the launch timeframe kept changing. So it was a major achievement, and actually we've been working on launch and early operations and commissioning the satellite, and that also has been particularly challenging. We've had some other really significant events last year. We've deorbited two of our satellites. Last year we deorbited METEOSAT 8, and the previous year we deorbited EPS-A. This is really quite important. As you may know, the sustainable use of space, avoiding cluttering up low Earth orbits with a lot of old satellites or satellite debris is becoming increasingly important. The satellites that we are currently operating were designed a long time ago and they weren't really designed to be deorbited to meet modern standards. But we managed to, through the great activities of our operations team, we managed to reposition the orbit of the geostationary satellite, having passivated it, which basically means dumping all of the fuel and running down the batteries, and that was a major achievement. Sentinel-6, Michael Freilich, an altimetry mission, took over as the reference mission. Now that was quite an achievement during its early launch. There were significant problems with the instrument. One of the key amplifiers was degrading far faster than anticipated, and we had to carry out a lot of unplanned activities. So that was a great success. I'll come back to this in a second, but we're looking at two new programs, Aeolus and Sterna. One's a microwave sounder, the other's a wind profiling space-based laser. And our council agreed the next tranche of funding to allow us to work up a proposal. European weather cloud ready for operational status. Destination Earth, which is a significant European Commission project, has proceeded well. We've been piloting buying data rather than operating our own missions as a small element of what we do. We've been looking at whether we can buy data from private sector providers. That pilot exercise has gone very well, actually, and we're looking at how we might be able to turn that into a sustainable activity. Like you, I imagine, we've had a lot of conversations about AI and machine learning and the implications for us. And we had agreement of a AI and machine learning roadmap agreed by Council. And given the importance of significance of climate change, we've had a first audit of our CO2 footprint in the organisation. The results of that will be presented to our delegate bodies at some point, and we'll look to put in place a roadmap to reduce our carbon footprint. So in terms of some of the challenges we've got as an organisation, launch services are a big issue. I've got a separate slide about that. We're coming to the end of the development cycle for our new missions. So that is the space segment, the hardware is coming close to finalisation. But the financial envelope for both our two key programs, the geostationary and low Earth orbit programs, we're pushing on the financial envelope. There's not we will at some point in the future have to ask for additional fundings. Most of this is driven by delays to the launch of the programs. A lot of that is to do with industry challenges. Some of it's to do with problems because of Ukraine. Some of it's to do with inflation. And just as generally as an organisation, I think this is no different. I'm sure it's no different to you. The workload we're under is very high, and we're having to prioritise and be clear about where we should focus our activities. And of course, the general financial and inflationary environment for all of us is difficult. Costs going up. We need to be careful and responsible in terms of how we manage our funding, and that's a big issue for us. Next slide, please. And again. So currently we are operating 10 satellites. As I said, in the last 2 years, we've decommissioned 2. So our fleet dropped a little bit, but now with the launch of MTGI-1, the fleet is starting to grow again. The principal element of that is our mandatory programs, geostationary and low Earth orbit, which we do principally to support the needs of weather services in Europe. We also run operate some satellites on behalf of the European Commission, and I'll come back to that and the work we'll do in the future. And we also operate Jason-3. Next slide, please. One of the big metrics, important elements of what we do is, given that we help you deliver your critical services to your users, the operational reliability of our platforms is incredibly important. So Generally speaking, the operational reliability has been very good, though we've had some challenges, which I'll come back to. So this is our performance against target for geostationary satellites. Now, you can see for the full Earth scan, the performance is very good. On the rapid scan system, you can see there are some, well, they're not actually problems, they're to be expected. With the decommissioning of METEOSAT 8, we no longer have redundancy, which means when we have to do planned operations for the satellite, which we have to do, their requirement to keep them operationally performing. When we have to basically take the satellite out of service, the data isn't available. So if you look at the graph on the right, the green is the availability of data from the satellite, and actually the light green is the planned operational standard. So these aren't incidents, this is just planned, but it's a consequence of where we are in the development cycle with no backups. Next slide, please. In terms of METOP availability, generally very good. This is a aggregated performance metric, so it's a bunch of data feeds brought together to show our overall performance, and we've been above target, almost above our 98% availability target almost all of the time. Occasionally we have issues with single event upsets, which are cosmic rays or solar rays having an impact on electronic circuitry, causing them to lock up, and we have to put satellites in safe mode and then restart them. These sort of things happen to every satellite. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the commissioning of MTGI. This has been really challenging. Right from the moment of launch, there were challenges. The solar arrays didn't deploy optimally. We had challenges in terms of putting the satellite into its final orbit. One of the systems that's certainly on modern satellites is a failure detection, anomaly detection routine on the satellite. If it sees something it doesn't like, it turns the satellite into safe mode. For a new satellite, all the tolerances of that are placed very tightly for safety reasons, but it means if something even slightly unexpected happens, an instrument or the satellite can shut down into a safe mode. So that's one of the issues that we're dealing with at the moment, is finding out what the right tolerance is for things. So the flexible combined imager for the satellite is operating well. We released the first image on May the 4th last week, and hopefully you've seen some of the images, but I'll come back to that in a second. And also we've switched on the Lightning imager. That is going to be a really challenging instrument. It's highly innovative. It was always going to be challenging to get it into operational status, but there are also some technical problems associated with the instrument that we knew before launch, but we have to work around. And the MTGS system, if you remember, that's the first operational flight of an atmospheric sounder. So we're very excited about that, but that's progressing well. Next slide, please. So this is, there's not much I can say about that, but this is the first retrieved real color image from the flexible combined imager. I have to say, you look at the technical specifications for FCI and you think, oh, that's good, that'll be impressive and an improvement. But the reality through the images is something else again, or at least in my view, and they're quite remarkable images. And some of the forecaster products that come from this, I'm hoping, will be very useful. Next slide, please. One of the key elements of FCI was the addition of a fire detection channel, as well as the improvement in quality of some of the channels that are also related to fire detection. So this is the sort of imagery that we'd get from Severi previously. And I think this is an example of a fire in Central Africa. Next slide, please. And this should be, yes, so this is a video of the sort of things we're seeing now. So you can see convective cloud starting to generate. And if you look at the top, sort of left of center, you can see a fire developing, and actually you can see the cloud of ash from this fire, which we've never been able to see before. And the resolution of this is very impressive. And this is, of course, not just relevant in Africa. There are lots of European countries who have a acute interest in fire detection and management. So this is really exciting. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, the release of the first imagery isn't an operational activity, and that's what we need to move towards. So the first release of data to beta users, the MAG and SAFs, will be in July. A pre-operational feed via EUMETCAST hopefully in November, and we're hoping to go fully operational with FCI towards the end of the year, beginning of next. Next slide, please. So there's far more. You'll be hopefully relieved that there's far more detail in the slides than I'm going to talk to, but because we're making the slides available, we thought it would be useful to put a little bit more detail in. So generally speaking, in terms of MTG overall, well, I've spoken about MTGI. The status is good. The other platforms and other instruments are progressing well. So that's all fine. In terms of MTGS, which I think we're very excited about the launch of that, and it'll be interesting to see how the user community use that. That's also progressing pretty well. The final integration of the MTGS platform is due to start in June this year, and it will be ready for launch in Q3 2024, hopefully. Next slide, please. Now, just to say, a big focus of our activity, the biggest focus of our activity, is the preparation of the ground segment, the data processing facility, and this for both of our satellites has been hugely challenging. The new satellites that we'll be launching are a step change in complexity. Certainly for geostationary, they're 3-axis stabilized rather than rotationally stabilized, which allows much better instrument performance, but is technically challenging. The data volumes are about 50 times higher than previously, but the processing requirements are very hard. So we've had lots of challenges with developing the ground segment, but that is certainly in terms of MTG, that's going much better, and we think that should be okay for launch. Next slide, please. So in terms of EPSSG, the second of our mandatory programs, again, like a lot of programs at the moment, that has some challenges. We carried out a rebaselining, and what that means is that ESA, who run the space segment, basically sit back, look at delays, look at challenges they're facing, and present develop a new program for launch. And the third rebaselining, which was approved by Council in 22, has introduced some significant delays. Two of the instruments that will fly on EPSSG are what we call customer furnished. So they are provided by, in this case, France and Germany. One is METImage, the other is IASI Next Generation. They're incredibly complicated, very impressive instruments, but they've been subject to quite a lot of delays, quite a lot of cost overruns, and they are driving the schedule of EPSSG development. However, when they are available, they'll be incredibly impressive and have a major impact for you, for weather services. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview. It's an excuse to show some interesting pictures, really. So these are the images. Just to say, the top right is an integrated platform about to go into a thermal, by the look of it, a thermal vac test chamber. I mean, these satellites are very big. I think they're both 4 or 5 tons in weight. For the geostationary satellites, a lot of that weight is actually fuel, less so for the low Earth orbit satellites. And I suppose they're about the size of a large minibus, so they're quite big. So in terms of METOP comprises 2 satellites, A and B. Mechanical tests for A have all been successfully completed, and thermal vac tests, as you can see, are about to start. For METOP B, B1, AIT, which is assembly, integration and testing activities, are progressing quite well, with all units integrated, but some of these units are pre-operational, the development units. And as I said, IRCNG and METImage are the challenging elements of this program, which, as I said, is understandable because of their complexity. Next slide, please. I'll just bring out the key points of this. There's an extensive program of system validation and software tests that take place years before a launch. They're progressing. We have some significant problems with the ground segment that we're purchasing from the private sector here, and that's a big issue. In terms of things that are perhaps more maybe quite interesting, is the development of a local processor for local deployment in weather services. That's going very well. And we have a strong partnership with NOAA in the US around a joint polar system. And the development of this joint system and joint approach is progressing quite well. In terms of Sentinel-5, and I should have pointed out earlier, as one of the features of both the geostationary and low Earth orbit programs, is that members agreed that we would be flying a Copernicus mission on each, and we're providing the space on the satellite for free. And that's part of our wider collaboration with the Commission. Sentinel-5 will be flying on EPSSG. We've had some challenges with the development of the ground processing software for that, and we're developing basically a stopgap bridging mechanism with that through a collaboration with ESA. Next slide, please. The big issue to take from this slide, many elements of the ground segment are progressing quite well. Mission control operations. The big challenge is the thing we call PDAP, which is the payload data acquisition and processing software. So this is the software that accepts the data, quality controls it, processes it. It's hugely challenging because of the data volumes, and industry, in this case it's TAS, are struggling to develop this. And I would say the one biggest point of concern for us as an organisation, and probably a key point of concern for our members, is the development of this software. Next slide, please. And this is really, I wouldn't necessarily take the launch dates as written in stone, because there's a lot of change around all of these. But the point is, for us, we've got an incredibly dense period of satellite launches coming. Effectively at least one a year, and sometimes with less than a gap less than a year. Now, for some of the organisations we work with, certainly industry, the key point for them is launch. Their involvement doesn't stop at that point, but once launch takes place, they generally tend to relax and see that as their job done. Well, that's absolutely not the case for us. We'll have been working hard for years before launch. When launch happens, there's launch and early operations, which can be challenging, and then we go into a commissioning phase, which can be very challenging, and is round about a year of very intense and hard work, and then we go into operations. So the combination of overlapping periods of launch preparation, early operations and commissioning for us means that we're going to be under a in a very challenging situation. On the positive, as we launch these satellites, we believe and hope that the impact for you, the users, and the benefits that will come to society will be enormous. So it's also a very exciting time for us. Next slide, please. I said I was going to say something about the launcher situation in Europe. It's been described by the Director General of ESA as a European crisis, and I think it probably is. There's been a sequence of problems because of the invasion of Ukraine. Soyuz, which has been a launcher workhorse for Europe for a long time, was withdrawn. And actually, our EPS second generation satellites were originally intended to be launched on Soyuz. So that is now not available. And Ariane 6, which was the next generation of heavy lift launcher from Arianespace, has been subject to significant delays. I think the current scheduled launch of the first mission is end of this year, beginning of next, but that will probably slip further. So that's having big implications on us. If there's a launch delay, actually, there's an awful lot of costs that have to be borne that we weren't expecting. Costs in industry, costs for storage, costs for our staff base. So it's a very serious issue. And we've been asking delegate bodies if we can look at other non-European providers as a backup in case the situation continues with Arianespace. So this is a very, very serious issue. Next slide, please. Now, just to move on a little bit, under our convention, we are tasked with establishing, operating, and exploiting a system of European meteorological satellites. That's the formal definition. In terms of exploitation, well, we don't, it's organizations like yourself that do the exploitation, that deliver the societal benefits and impacts. But we have a responsibility, and I see it as an incredibly important responsibility, to make sure that we make our data available in the best way, in the most useful way, so you can access it, exploit it, and that's how benefits deliver. So the whole area of data management, data dissemination is a key skill for us. And there's quite a few activities that we're doing that relate to this. So just in terms of our data lake, current performance of this. So this is the database that underpins the provision of data from our organization. I mean, you can choose some impressive statistics, but 400 terabytes delivered per month, 4 million separate products delivered per month, 15 million items in our catalogue, 99.8% availability. This is a critical element of our capability, and it shows the scale of our work at the moment. Next slide, please. So the first thing, and I'm sure some of you in the room are aware of this. So this isn't a core program in the way that MTG or EPSSG would be, although the funding comes out of the same program envelope. So the European Weather Cloud is a joint project between us, ECNWF, and member states to put in place a cloud-based infrastructure that can allow storage, access, processing of data, and that I think has been progressing well. The implementation of that going into operational status has been slightly delayed because of some of the challenges that ECMWF have had at their new data center in Bologna. So that's where they're hosting their element of this. But we're pretty close to going operational. I think this is a very exciting development, and the thing I'm particularly interested in is how this is a mechanism for collaboration among European weather services, how weather services can work together on developing new applications and new approaches and share development. So I think it's a very exciting project. Next slide, please. So what I've talked about so far is mostly the mandatory programs that are funded by all of our member states. What's become increasingly important is the work that we undertake for the Commission through supporting their Copernicus programme. Last year, and we had under Copernicus 1, we had an agreement with them to operate a number of their satellites. We agreed the next stage of that, Copernicus 2.0, which will operate until 2027, which covers the next tranche of our activities. I won't go into the detail of all of the things we're doing, but what it does mean is that we are probably, I think we are, the biggest operator of European Commission or Copernicus satellites. So I've already talked about the Sentinel 4 and 5 that will be flying on our mission. We've got responsibility for an element of the CO2M ground segment, which is a CO2, part of a CO2 monitoring constellation. The next generation of altimetry missions, Sentinel-3, next generation optical, and work on Simmer and Crystal. So it's very exciting work for us in the future, and an expansion of our role. And just to say, when we do this, we're very careful to make sure that there is separation between the things we do for our members and the things we do for the European Commission. And wherever possible, that the work we do for the European Commission is benefiting our core programmes through skills we learn or infrastructure we implement. Next slide, please. As part of the work we do for the European Commission, and this is another area that relates to data dissemination, is in partnership with ECMWF, the European Environment Agency, and Mercator Ocean, is to develop the Wikio infrastructure. So this is an infrastructure providing access to Copernicus data, and again, particularly for some data source, for some data is a real key source of access. Next slide, please. Now, this is another theme that relates to data access and processing, but is slightly different. So the Commission instigated a programme called Destination Earth. Destination Earth is, I think, hugely ambitious, potentially strategically very important. Effectively, this is a mechanism in which digital twins, which in principle are interactive models of aspects of the Earth system, are operated with access to where the data that's output from these digital twins is stored, where Earth observing and other data is stored. And users have access to both the data and the models. So we have a particular responsibility for that. Our responsibility is for managing the data lake. Again, because the management of a data lake is the same set of skills and activities that we're deploying in our mandatory missions. So again, this allows us to build our capability and build our understanding. ECMWF have responsibility for the digital twins. So they are putting in place a standard for what digital twins should look like and how they should operate. And they're taking responsibility for the extremes and climate change digital twins. And I think there's heavy involvement from weather services across Europe in that. ESA are providing the user portal and user interface to both the data and the digital twins. And we're about to move into, we're having discussions with the Commission about phase 2 of funding for that. And I think we're coming close to an agreed way forward. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just to, I said we're looking at 2 new future programmes. And we're currently in the process of submitting an initial programme proposal to our delegate bodies. And in fact, that's one of the things we did this week to joint STG AFG. So the first one of these is Aeolus, which our programme is called EPS Aeolus. This is a follow-on from the ESA Aeolus mission, which is in the process of being turned off and deorbited. And I think that's happening about now. So it's a space-based UV laser that measures profiles atmospheric wind, but also can be used for gathering information about aerosols. Over the last few years, that's demonstrated a really significant impact on NWP scores. And and what we are developing is a program that will turn this into an operational mission. 2 satellites operating one after the other with a lifetime of around 10 years. Now, there have been problems with the pilot mission. The laser performance has degraded faster than anticipated. And the solution of that is to change basically the optics around the laser from a single channel that transmits and receives the laser light to what's called a bistatic arrangement. So there is some technological change. But again, we're in the process of running impact studies on this, and that's likely to demonstrate a potential huge impact on NWP schools. Next slide, please. So the second new program that we're discussing with members is Sterna. Again, this is a follow-on from an ESA mission, the Arctic Weather Satellite. It's a microwave sounder primarily retrieving humidity and temperature profiles. This is if this is approved, it will be quite new for us, and more akin to new space. And new space in the space community is a new approach of smaller satellites, often operating in constellations that are developed and launched faster. So the proposal here is that we would operate a constellation of 6 satellites operating in 3 orbital planes. The technology is quite simple and reliable, and there won't be much in the way of changes from the ESA demonstrator mission. The challenge is the operation of a constellation. That will be a challenge for us, and I think it will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the user community can work with data from constellations. So the expectation is that the satellites would be swapped out every 3 years, rather than 10 or in some cases even 20 years for our traditional programs. So how the user community will deal with that is an interesting question. Next slide, please. We're also looking at future altimetry missions, and we'll be coming with a proposal to member states, and I think it's 2025. And this is continuing our heritage and involvement with altimetry. And we're also considering, I should step back a little bit. For the MTG program, there is a imaging mission and a sounding mission. We have 2 satellites, 2 sounding satellites, and 4 imaging satellites. The imaging satellites, because there were 4 of them, there's some redundancy built in. For the sounding satellite, we don't have that level of redundancy. And there's been a question by members that the geostationary sounding satellite that's never been run operationally before could have a really big impact. And do we want to actually buy a 3rd sounding satellite for additional funding to manage the risk around the program? And we'll be in discussion with members about that this year. Next slide, please. As I said, we've been buying radio occultation data from a company called Spire and evaluating how that performs. I mean, really, it's performed very well. They've been very good technically. It's demonstrated a positive impact on NWP scores. That's sort of not surprising. The technology they use is well established. I think the community understood the impact of radio occultation data. Actually, what we're testing is how to manage a relationship with a commercial provider and how that works, what the business model is, how we deal with price fluctuations. But nonetheless, it's gone very well. And it matches initiatives in the US where they're also buying radio occultation data from the private sector. And we're in discussions with members about how we might do this on a continuing basis rather than as a pilot. Next slide, please. I mentioned the AI and machine learning roadmap. The potential, as I'm sure you're aware, the potential implications of AI and machine learning on NWP are very significant. We were at a bilateral with ECMWF last week, and they showed some results of, I think it was Pangu, which were, they weren't as good, but they were in the same domain as ECMWF's output for certain parameters. And these AI and machine learning models were running nearly 600,000 times faster. So, I mean, this is, this is remarkable, and it will be very interesting to see where this goes. That obviously doesn't necessarily affect us, but if AI and machine learning becomes important for you, it may change how we need to provide data and what we need to do. But behind that, AI and machine learning, we're seeing increasing applications for processing data, exploiting our data, for supporting operations. So it's relevant to us in a wide range of areas, and we have a roadmap approved to take that forward. Next slide, please. I'll only touch on this briefly because I suspect it's not desperately interesting for most of our audience, but very, very crucial for a small number of our audience. This is a projected graph of subscriptions. That's basically how much our members pay us over the coming years. The peaks and troughs that we see in the profile are very difficult for members to manage. It's much better if subscription levels are broadly the same over time. So we're working very hard to try and flatten the peaks and to even out the troughs. So one of the things that we've been in discussion with is revising our assumptions about the operating lifetime of our next generation programs, what's called dephasing. Because if we dephase our next generation programs, that means the ones that we're launching now, it means we can dephase the development of the generation after that, and the financial profile becomes flatter. Next slide, please. And finally, just to look at Spain as a part of EUMETSAT. So Spain is the 5th biggest contributor. Contributes about just under 7% of funding to our activities. So a significant organizer, a significant member state in comparison to others. Next slide, please. And a significant number of our staff come from Spain, actually proportionately higher. So just over 13% of our staff come from Spain against a contribution of 6%. So where Spain is well represented out of a staff of about 600 people. So you're well represented. Next slide, please. Obviously, you're a lead of one SAF and heavily involved in another, so the nowcasting SAF being your lead and land surfaces SAF being heavily involved with. Just to say, the SAFs are a really important capability, a really important function for us as an organisation, because as I often say, if we invest hugely in space-based infrastructure, if the data that's generated from that doesn't end up being used and doesn't end up having an impact and doesn't end up benefiting society, then actually the investment in infrastructure is wasted. And the SAFs are a really important way of making sure our data is exploited. Next slide, please. Of course, in terms of the nowcasting SAF, which you're the lead on, number of products coming from there. These are just illustrations of, I think it's radiation flux, precipitable water, and high resolution winds derived from atmospheric motion vectors, but really interesting products and very relevant for forecasting. Next slide, please. And again, sorry, the radiative balance was on the land surface. SAF. I got my slides in the wrong order, but again, some interesting and very relevant products. So this is sensible and latent flux, downward long wave flux, and production index. Next slide, please. Spain is also an important industrial partner within our programs, particularly the EPS second generation program, where they're heavily involved in the ICI instrument and also a subcontractor to an important electronics processing unit for the satellite, the SCAR. Next slide, please. Also significant involvement in other areas, ground segment development, the ground segment for CO2M, involved in destination Earth procurements, and a number of other areas. So Spain is an important industrial partner. Next slide, please. I'll need to wrap up quite quickly. Just a few other things to say that relates to a potential role for Spain in the future. Under the Copernicus Ocean Colour programme from Sentinel-3, there's a need for vicarious calibration activities, and we're working on the engineering design process for that, and progress has been approved by the European Commission. As part of that, we'll be running a competition. Next slide, please. We'll be running a competition for the provision of ground-based calibration, and basically this is just a timetable for the activity. And Spain is in a very strong position to provide that capability to the Copernicus programme, and we'll be launching an ITT in the future. Next slide, please. Of course, AEMET is EUMETSAT's key partner in training in the Spanish language, and we've got a long history of involvement there. I won't go through all of the details, but we've partnered in a number of activities and a number of meetings to shape training in Spanish-speaking parts of the world. Next slide, please. And that's done. And we've got about 9 minutes for any questions if anyone wants to ask any. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Phil, for this very comprehensive presentation. I'm here to help you take some questions in case anyone wants to ask something.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would be interested to know how are you are talking about the staff, and how are you manage the building capacity that you lost when the people with a lot of experience is retired and the new generations are coming to the EUMETSAT?
Thank you. It's a very good question. I'm sort of smiling because it's a really big challenge for us. So before my time as Director General, we identified that there was going to be a demographic peak of people with a huge amount of experience who were going to retire, and we're seeing that wave of retirement taking place now. And actually, that's an issue for the whole aerospace industry. If you look at the age profile of aerospace, there's a lot of people who are very experienced are coming close to retirement. So it's not just us. We manage it by reviewing the skills that we need, and we're quite specific about that. Every year we review who's going to be retiring, where they work, how we're going to manage the skills loss. Sometimes by looking at the equivalent skills in the organisation, but also recognising when we need to run a competition, which is the default thing for us. Sometimes, if people want to work a bit longer than when they can retire, we'll extend contracts just to manage it. So we do a lot of work on this, and I think this proposal came as a HR strategy to council a number of years ago. You know, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to bring in younger staff who've got different ideas. So it is hard, but it's also an opportunity as well.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Phil, for the nice presentation. I have just a small curiosity about the Wikio slide. When you put the slide, all the feedbackers, like European Environmental Agency, come from their country, and Spain also. There was a point in Spain that feedback the Wikio. I would like to know which organization is, or.
Do you want to answer that, Paul? Do you know?
Yes, in the map of the slide of Wikio, there is a point in Spain that feedbacks Wikio. I don't know.
No, I don't think. No, they're not random. No. There is one. It's not random.
Sorry.
But no. We'll find out.
Okay.
And I should know, actually. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. I don't know if I don't understand correctly, but you say that for AELUS mission will be 2 satellites in 10 years. I was wondering if it was 2 satellites on the same time, or maybe one after another.
So I missed some of the.
But
so is this about the next generation satellites?
Yeah,
So the full constellation for the geostationary satellites, when it's fully operational with the full constellation, we have at the same time 2 imaging satellites, one taking a full disk observations, one carrying out rapid scan over Europe, and one sounding satellite. So for the geostationary mission, it's 3 satellites in parallel. Obviously, it will take time to launch all of those. For the low Earth orbit, EPS-SG, the constellation is 2 satellites, A and B, that will be operating at the same time. Does that answer your question? Or no? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. No, it's serial. It's one after the other, and there'll be a period of overlap in the middle, but it's one after the other. Sorry for getting your question.
Both answers are very interesting, so no problem at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil, for your presentation again. We're closing the streaming now, I guess. Bueno, gracias a todos los que lo habéis seguido.